until the 17th century. For example, a lot of sources are still calculating intervals from the tenor as opposed to from the bass, which is interesting. Thomas,
Why the tenor? Why is the tenor the holding voice rather than the bass?
I suppose it depends. It's a little bit like everything in Renaissance and medieval music theory, a little bit convention. So if you go back through your many centuries, then you find that the tenor is typically the lowest voice. Let's just say, for example, looking at Parisian organum, the tenor is simply the voice which you could say which holds the chant, but perhaps more accurately supports the structure of the composition or the improvisation. And this is called the tenor from tenere, the Latin to hold, but it's the lowest voice. And then as you find that with this comes the development of the contratenor, the voice which moves against the tenor, which can be either above or below, or indeed working both above and below. And at the end of the 15th century in particular, you start to find really a concrete, a sort of convention of a voice below a contratenor bassus and a contratenor altus. And therefore, sort of through this process of evolution, you find the tenor being, in a way, this middle voice with a contratenor bassus, a bass below it, and a contratenor altus, an alto above it, and of course the superius or cantus or discantus above that as well. And with this with this sort of, I suppose, evolutionary way of thinking, and that's always a little bit dangerous, but hopefully you'll forgive me. You can see how that intervals calculated from the tenor, this tradition sort of remains. And so one example I find really interesting, again, from Ornithoparchus, he talks about, and he's not the only theorist to do so, but I remember Ornithoparchus particularly. He talks about a cadence on E. So the tenor does its tenorosans, its step down F to E. The soprano, the superius, does its cantizans D to E. And this is a structural cadential pairing. However, he adds to this, not as an afterthought so much, but as an addition to this structural cadential pairing. And the lowest voice, of course, it can't do B to E, because then it has this tritone with the F, B to F. The lowest voice goes D to A. But this is still essentially a description of the cadence on E, even though the lowest voice is moving D to A. So does that make sense a little bit? So it's just this different way of thinking that in those instances, the voices are calculated from the tenor. But as I say, this does change a lot during the 16th century. Morley is a great example at the end of the century because he's a little bit topsy-turvy with it. He talks about calculating consonances from the tenor, but then also continues to calculate consonances from the bass later on in the treatise. But it's you're right. It feels somewhat counterintuitive for us. There's Morley.
So you said that the tenor was the lowest voice, but so they didn't have basses back then?
Good question. So pitch and voice range is a bit of a complicated issue. You're right. We very clearly associate today words like tenor or, well, tenor is a good example as any, tenor with a specific way of singing, a specific set of frequencies which the human voice is producing. But it's not quite as clear-cut as that, especially let's say 14th century and earlier. Tenor in particular has this function of, it has this role as a sort of compositional contrapuntal function, as opposed to necessarily being associated with a specific sort of voice. However, as ensembles and compositional styles become increasingly standardized, these voices essentially become more and more connected with certain, these compositional voices become more and more connected with with voices, with the human voice. So you can find, for example, references to people being sent north, typically Italians being sent north to find specifically high altos, high contratenors, or low basses, and that sort of thing. But the question of pitch itself is a bit of a tricky one. So in its broadest sense, pitch is quite flexible. A lot of sources say quite clearly that the pitch is set according to the range of the singer, according to the range of the person giving the intonation, for example, in plain chant, etc. And that therefore plagal modes, for example, which tend to descend, should be sung a little higher, and authentic modes which tend to ascend should be sung a little lower. But this gets a little bit more complicated when we consider the sort of increasingly standardized voicings of the contrapuntal idiom of this time, which means that certain modes, or it's a difficult way of saying it, what's a better way of saying it? That these voice types, although the pitch is essentially determined by the singers, certain conventions arise regarding pitch and, let's say, transposition. And this is, of course, codified and classified in the 16th century through the technique, through the practice of chiavetti, or high clefs, basically the conventions in which certain clefs are transposed down either a fifth or a fourth, depending on which, or certain combinations of clefs, sorry. But broadly, therefore, certain voice types become quite heavily clearly associated with certain voices, compositional voices. However, even in the 16th century, this isn't set by any means. We have lots of references, for example, of practices in convents where voices were transposed. Sometimes only a few voices were transposed. Sometimes the whole thing was transposed upwards. You have therefore nuns singing bass. Sometimes even, in fact, we have reference to nuns with very low voices singing the bass part, but also things being transposed up so that the bass part is sung then in the middle of the texture, which is really interesting, can create some...
Really? Okay.
What's the name of the theorist who talks about that explicitly? There's a great article by Laurie Strass, who's a musicologist, who's done a lot of work around performance practices of nuns in the later 16th century. And she cites a theorist whose name is Vecchi, Orazio Vecchi, at the beginning of the 17th century, who describes a series of transpositions, including some which involve, if this is our four-part texture, something like this. So then you have lower voices becoming middle voices, etc. It's pretty wild. I can't remember all the details.
Would they take established compositions and do that?
It seems that way, creating what you could call voci pari settings, equal voice settings, out of voce piena settings. And also the other way around. So you have references of full voce piena is full voice. So let's say SATB. You also have the opposite. So I think it's Pietro Aaron, off the top of my head, although I might be wrong on that, describes how you can create a voce pari setting of equal voices by transposing the upper voice down an octave and having it sung by a tenor, which of course seems far more logical perhaps in our mind. It's a tricky one. Pitch, transposition, and voice ranges and voice types in this period is complicated. There's an added possible difficulty. Perhaps that's for another day. It's a tricky one.